Amen. So, in our first presentation, we reminded ourselves that sexism is the oldest, deepest, the worst, and the most fundamental form of oppression that started in Eden and developed as a consequence of the first sin. And we saw how it developed into other forms of oppression over time, and that God wants to restore its damage at the end of the world. And we said that it's important for us to become sensitized to recognize sexism and misogyny, the workings of patriarchy in and around us. So we had a look at history, our ancient Roman and Greek culture, and how that culture has shaped or given us a template for what we consider authority, what we consider to be a good template for good speech, leadership. And now we want to come to the present. We want to draw on one chapter of Kate Mann's book, Entitled, where she looks at the entitlement to power that society as a whole deems men entitled to positions of power. And we want to do that by going into some scientific research. I have actually wrote down some references for you on the board. I'm not sure if you can all read it. But I can also send you the reference later if that helps. Our first study we want to look at is from the year 2004, conducted by Madeleine Heilman. I'm not sure how to pronounce her name. Then we are looking at a second study that she conducted with someone else. So the first, it's the same author, but not always the same colleagues were involved in both of those studies. And the third study is by David Paul and Jesse Smith, examining vote preferences when women run against men for the presidency. So let's start with the first study. That's an experiment. The researchers conducted an experiment with two invented persons, a man and a woman. They called them James and Andrea. And what they did is the participants of the study received two personnel files with a description of those two persons. So you had a file X and a file Y, one describing James, the other one describing Andrea. The participants would read about their history in the company. It was an aircraft company. And both James and Andrea had the same male-coded leadership position at that company. So a job that would traditionally be considered a man's job. And what they did is that they switched the description of these two persons for half of the participants. So when half of the participants had description X with the name James and description Y for Andrea, they switched that for the other half of the participants to make sure. They did that to make sure that the description itself, which wasn't identical, it wouldn't be the description itself that would influence the results or cause different results. So after reading these files with the description James and Andrea, the participants were asked to fill in a questionnaire. They needed to evaluate those two persons on their competence and their likability. So you had James and Andrea. And they wanted to know, who do you think is more competent and who do you consider more likable? Okay. First of all, the participants were given a file where the description was vague about the competence of James and Andrea. So they didn't have specific information on their competence. I will write it down. No info on competence. And participants needed to evaluate whom they found more competent, thought was more competent, and whom they thought was more likable. And the outcome was that without any information on competence, 86% judged James to be more competent than Andrea. Only 14% thought that Andrea would be more competent. At the same time, they did not think that one or the other was more likable. So likability was about 50-50. But that changed when the file contained information about James and Andrea's competence. So now they were given a different description that included information that said something like they are both in the top 5% of all employees at their level. In this case, so now they took away this automatic reasoning of the participants. They told them, no. James and Andrea, they're equally competent. When they gave them this information, now they had information on competence. And now we're looking at likability because that changed. In that case, 83% thought that James was more likable than Andrea. And in turn, Andrea was described. There was also space for the participants to elaborate on their answers, and the terms in which they described Andrea was sneaky, pushy, aggressive, selfish, manipulative, untrustworthy. Get the idea? Not nice. So, and interesting was that this bias was it didn't depend on the gender of the participants. Men as well as women. Yeah, they showed the same bias against Andrea. In a follow-up study, so now we're talking about, this was our 2004 study, and now we're going to the next one. They did a follow-up experiment because now they wanted to look into why those women are penalized for success at male tasks. They wanted to know why the women face this negative bias when they are doing male gender typed work, even though that there is evidence, or even because there is evidence that they are successful in it. Because once the participants knew that both Andrea and James are equally competent at their job, they started to dislike Andrea and prefer James. So why is it that women are disliked for being competent in a traditional man's role? Is there anything women could do to avoid being disliked for being successful in a position of power? So, and their hypothesis was that people perceive women in such a position as lacking communality. That's a characteristic we would summarize as, let's say, like communality includes being kind, social, showing concern for others, you get the idea? You're sympathetic, you're caring, you stimulate a sense of togetherness. That's what the researchers assumed, that the participants would, as soon as they know a woman is successful in a leadership position, they would assume that she is lacking communality. So now they let the participants read the descriptions and again evaluate James and Andrea in the questionnaire. And first, they didn't give them any additional information, which reproduced the same results that they got in the previous experiment. But next, they told the participants explicitly that both James and Andrea have a communal mindset. So let me say, write this down. No info. When they didn't have information on their communality, 72% thought James is more likable than Andrea. As I said, it's kind of aligns with the results of the previous studies. But when they gave them information on their communality, and they would include in the description sentences like, they show their understanding and they are concerned about others. They encourage cooperation and helpful behavior. They have worked to increase their employees' sense of belonging. So that's how they would tell them they have a communal mindset. Now that totally switched the outcome of the experiment. And now people would prefer Andrea as the more desirable and likable boss. Now 68% versus 32 thought Andrea is more likable. And they no longer attributed these negative characteristics to her. So the women, or the woman, Andrea, didn't actively need to, she didn't need to show uncaring attributes to be perceived as communal, uncommunal, sorry. And as a consequence, be punished for that by being disliked. Basically, all the participants needed to know is that the woman is successful in a man's position, and they automatically assumed she has negative characteristics, negative character traits, and they punished her by disliking her. So, and the other thing that is important to note is that the positive effect of communality was huge in Andrea's case. Once the participants knew they have a communal mindset, it's not only that she was described as having a communal mindset. The same information was included for James, but it only had this huge positive effect for Andrea. James was also described as communal, as I said, but apparently he was not rewarded for it. So we don't seem to need that characteristic in a man so much, or yeah. There seems to be that society expects something of a woman that they would not in the same degree expect from a man. And so you could think that that's good news, because when women just play on the communality card, then they could have an advantage over men there. The problem is that it turns out to be almost impossible to constantly live up to these expectations. For example, in an election campaign, you want to be president or speaker of the House. You also need to be, you sometimes have to be commanding, stand your ground, and how should I say that? Because it's more like a double standard, because on one hand, we have seen society has a certain expectation for what a leadership role looks like. And as a woman, because this template is male, as a woman, you're kind of asked or expected to live up to these ideas. But on the other hand, if you do that, then you might be accused of being inauthentic, or just wanting to gain power, or that was, for example, that was something that Hillary Clinton was accused of as well, of being inauthentic, just faking it, faking everything. And because you are also covered in a time where information by media coverage is accessible almost 24/7, it's very easy to find some evidence about a prominent woman that would portray her to having at some point in time been insufficiently caring or considerate. So I want to read a quote from the document. It's quote number 6. The right way to take these points is a matter of some delicacy. Being communal is an important virtue, but there are many virtues we expect leaders to possess, and it is neither realistic nor fair to expect every person in a position of power to be extraordinarily communal, as opposed to reasonably kind, empathetic, considerate, and so on. There is also the simple point that to the extent that our communal expectations of women are indeed reasonable, we often have a long way to go in holding men to the same warranted moral standards. So the problem is not that communality is not important, but it's more important for us to see it in women than in men. And when women don't act, when women make a mistake in this area that makes them being perceived not communal, then they are punished much more by being disliked, losing support than the men would be. She earns more criticism by the media and the public. It can cost her a lot if she then in this area makes a mistake, which is only human. So that's about this double standard that we hold women to when it comes to communality. And now we're adding another layer to this study, because in another one more experiment, researchers worked with the same employee files again. And the files, this time, it included information that James and Andrea had behaved in communal ways, but with a crucial difference. In the last experiment, they told them that James and Andrea had a communal mindset, and that suggests that the communality is a part of their character. It's a natural or intrinsic characteristics of them. But now they took that part away, and instead they changed the description to read as follows. In his or her last year at company X, James or Andrea worked for a supervisor who was known for placing high importance on employee relations. Or in recent years, company X has updated their mission statement, placing greater importance on understanding the concerns of employees. As a part of this company-wide initiative, James or Andrea made an exceptional effort to stimulate communality in the company. So you see that they changed the motivation for the communal behavior. Here it was their mindset, which suggests they are like this as a person, and now they say they showed communal behavior. they only said they behaved in a communal way, but there was room to assume or infer that communal behavior was only demonstrated because it was expected from them. And the result was that 70% preferred James. So the outcome switched again. Now James was the more likable again. With 70% judging James more likable and only 30% for Andrea. So again, the woman was apparently punished for the fact that the communal behavior was not part of her character. It seems to be that here we saw the communal mindset, the information on the communal mindset had a huge positive effect on Andrea. She was rewarded for that. But it was only because it could be attributed to her nature, to her own character. As soon as that is taken away, and there was room to think that she only does that because she only behaves in a communal way, because she's expected to, then she was less likable again. So that shows us some of those unconscious hidden biases that we as a society still hold on to or show. Now I have a third study examining vote preferences of participants. In this study, this was really about elections. The participants were given 3 Republican candidates and 2 Democratic candidates in a hypothetical election. So let's you had 2 male Republicans. I'm not going to write down their name. It's only about the idea. Here you have two men and a woman. And here you had a man and a woman. And now they randomly set up those candidates against each other and asked the participants, if there was an election today, if you could choose, whom would you vote for? So they matched them up in random pairs. Also, sometimes from the same party, because it was just hypothetical. And in every single one of these pairings, when there was a female candidate against the male candidate, the female candidate always lost against a male. And what was significant is that sometimes the candidates even purposely avoided having to vote for a woman by voting for a man of the other party, so of the party that wasn't their party that they would traditionally vote for. That's what the researchers knew from the participants, where they stand politically and what their usual voting preferences were. So many Democratic voters chose a male Republican candidate instead of Hillary Clinton, for example. I think she was one of those women. And that's quite significant if you consider the tendency of American voters to vote for one specific party, and they just then defect to avoid having to vote for a woman. Okay. And I think that the first study can give us some background as to why people make these choices. If we have a choice, to shortly recap what we have seen in these studies, if people have a choice between a male and a female leader, they will see the man often is then seen as the more competent. If you tell them they are equally competent, if there's enough evidence that that is the case, then there will always be a reason to dislike the woman. And why is that? Because as the experiment showed, the participants automatically assumed she lacks certain qualities that would traditionally be defined as female. It's communality. And only if you tell them that the woman actually has those characteristics, the negative bias can be turned away. But only if it can be attributed to her character, and not if she just, if there's room to believe she only acts it, or she fakes it, or she only acts upon expectations. Okay, now I want to, at this point, take up a model from Kate Mann's book, where she classifies the terms patriarchy, sexism, and misogyny, and helps us to differentiate between those terms. So if you have patriarchy, that's a male-dominated society and governance. And sexism and misogyny act as two different branches of the patriarchal system. We want to read from the document, quote number 7. Misogyny should not be understood as a monolithic, deep-seated psychological hatred of girls and women. Instead, it's best to conceptualize it as the law enforcement branch of patriarchy, a system that functions to police and enforce gendered norms and expectations, and involves girls and women facing disproportionately or distinctively hostile treatment because of their gender, among other factors. In addition to this, misogyny is typically a response to a woman's violations of gendered law and order. So we have She calls it the law enforcement branch of patriarchy. And it's the mechanisms that work to police and enforce gendered norms and expectations. So it's like police and enforce gendered norms. And it's the punishment for women's violation of gendered law and order. So I write down punishment. And then she gives another picture. She says you can picture it like a shock collar for dogs to keep them in a certain area. So you have these devices, you can put them on a dog's neck, and you have like in your yard, then you have like an invisible fence. And every time the dog wants to cross that line, that border, then this electric or this device around their neck gives them an electric shock. So that's how she likens the workings of misogyny to this shock collar. Because misogyny works to keep women in a designated area, in a space that has been traditionally ascribed to them. And as soon as they venture out of their zone that is traditionally assigned to them, then they get one of these electroshocks. But that's, of course, that's like that's a parable. And there are hundreds of examples of how misogyny manifests then in society. And they're described in all of the chapters of this book. So it's really worth a read to get a better idea of how it really looks in real life. So we will see that misogyny is the more practical part of the two branches. The law enforcement branch, also said it's the shock collar. And when this is the law enforcement, on the other hand, we have sexism, which is the law. It's the more theoretical branch of patriarchy. It's the ideology and the theory behind misogyny. It's the ideology and the beliefs and ideas that work to justify and rationalize patriarchal norms. So let's read our next quote. It's number 9 in the document. In contrast to misogyny, I take sexism to be the theoretical and ideological branch of patriarchy. So, theory, ideology. The beliefs, ideas, and assumptions that serve to rationalize and naturalize patriarchal norms and expectations, including a gendered division of labor and men's dominance over women in areas of traditionally male power and authority. We have beliefs, ideas, assumptions, and they serve to justify these patriarchal norms. Justify the gender norms. And this law, so we had misogyny, law enforcement, sexism is the law. This law is 6,000 years in the making, consists of stereotypes we have about men and women. We saw in Mary Beard, when we went into the history of the ancient Greeks, we saw where some of these things come from. But also we have an atheist would use biology to reason, to rationalize these gendered norms. Christians would use the Bible. They have their explanation there. They all come to the same conclusions about gender roles. So these are these ideological, theoretical ideas behind the gendered norms that work to justify them. So sexism, the more theoretic part, the ideology, and misogyny is the more practical part, how women are kept in their place. So if we go back to the 2016 election and the question, why is it still so hard for women to get elected? Because that was really the question that was agitated after Hillary Clinton lost the election. We can see that she had a very hard time in her election campaign. She was often accused of being fake, inauthentic, just trying to gain power. Before, when she was Secretary of State, she actually had very good ratings that showed that she was very popular. However, that changed once she ran for the presidency. So when we remember the studies we looked at, there is something about women striving for these high positions of power that our society continues to find off-putting. And as soon as they, like with competence, they automatically, it is assumed a man would be more competent than a woman when you have them next to each other. But when you tell them that they're equally competent, the woman is disliked for it, because that in turn suggests that she must have certain characteristics or she must lack certain characteristics. There's so much that is being inferred. So in her time when she was running for the presidency, Hillary Clinton was also portrayed by the media as being indifferent to, there was to the fates of people in Benghazi, in Libya. There was something that portrayed her as being uncaring or uncommunal, you could say. And also remember the email scandal about the emails that leaked, that she was indifferent to matters of national security. So there was a negative emphasis on uncommunal behavior on her side, and she was accordingly punished for that. I'd like to also bring up to our attention another incident that was, you might remember there was a controversy at one point between Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren about a sexist remark that Bernie Sanders apparently made. So there it was, yeah, sorry, that was, I think I said something else. It was in the 2020 election. It was in 2018. Yeah, but it was before the 2020 election. Warren told Sanders in a private meeting that she was planning to run for the presidency. And told by Warren insiders is that Sanders replied to her saying that to him. He replied by saying he didn't think that a woman could beat Trump. But Sanders denied that he said that, and the whole thing evolved into a controversy. So whatever was the truth, in the end, Warren was blamed for being incorrect, immoral, manipulative, and that she was just using smear tactics because she wants to damage a political competitor. And memes started circulating of her, depicting her as a snake, the lying one. He said, I said this, and she said, no, you said this. But people tend to believe him in this case. And when she says, no, he's lying, then she was perceived as the one who was attacking him. And so basically when the man and the woman clash, the woman is the one who is being sneaky and mean, manipulative. So what he maintains, he actually says or said, is that Trump would weaponize sexism against a female candidate. And even though we don't know exactly what Bernie Sanders said, let alone what he really meant, at the very least, that even him mentioning that it infers that it would have been hard for a woman to beat Trump. And in this time, it was not only him who said something like that, because there were also many respected newspapers that had headlines that would in some way suggest it could be or can a woman ever beat Trump? Would a woman be able to have a chance against him? So that was respected newspapers like the Washington Post, the New York Times, Newsweek, sources that we could, I don't want to say they belong to the good stream of information, because of course, we have to sift every single source, every single article. You can't say all articles from the Washington Post are good, but we certainly could say they are a trustworthy source where we can often find good information. But even those good sources had these headlines that made it appear that it would be very hard for a woman to beat Trump. They asked the question in some shape or form, is that even possible? And if enough people fear that it would be hard for a woman to win, what does that do to a woman candidate, a female candidate? It makes her an uncertain candidate. There was a poll from June 2019. I found it a very interesting poll. The participants the voters were asked who they would vote for in an election that would be held that day. And then when that was the question, who would you vote for? Then Joe Biden or Bernie Sanders were the favorites. But when they changed the question, when they asked the voters who would they want to be president, if they could wave a magic wand, then Elizabeth Warren emerged as the narrow favorite. Let's read quote number 10, the conclusion about this poll. So concerns about electability plausibly led some people to give up on Warren prematurely, despite her being their favorite Democratic candidate. This was especially true for women. As Nate Silver for the election forecasting website 538 put it, there are a lot of women who might not vote for a woman because they're worried that other voters won't vote for her. But if everyone just voted for who they actually wanted to be president, the woman would win. So really, if we take that to Bernie Sanders' statement, even if he said Trump would weaponize sexism against a female candidate, it doesn't matter what he really said. It doesn't even matter what his intent was. If he had sexist thoughts or not. We don't have to be able to look into his heart to see if sexism was the root or the intent of this statement. For him, in a powerful position, he had the opportunity to strengthen a female candidacy by not questioning it. If he's really so progressive, as many say he is, because he's regarded by many as the most progressive senator, or he was back then. I want us to see that this questioning, this climate of questioning a female candidacy was creating uncertainty. And it could have very well been the case that this led to people giving up on a female candidacy at all. And I want to stress also that it's not, this is about Elizabeth Warren. I don't want to say that she would have been the right candidate or something like that, but it's just to show the dynamics between male and female candidates. I want to read quote number 11, and we are going to finish with this quote. We need to understand that someone can engage in misogynistic behavior without necessarily having sexist beliefs about women. My account on misogyny counsels us to focus less on the individual perpetrators of misogyny and more on misogyny's targets and victims. This is helpful for at least two reasons. First, some instances of misogyny lack any individual perpetrators whatsoever. Misogyny may be a purely structural phenomenon perpetuated by social institutions, policies, and broader cultural mores. So it doesn't have to be a person that keeps a woman in her place. It can be a purely structural phenomenon that is embedded in our policies, in our culture. Second, understanding misogyny as more about the hostility girls and women face as opposed to the hostility men feel deep down in their hearts helps us avoid a problem of psychological inscrutability. She explains what that is. It's often difficult to know what someone's innermost states and ultimate motivations are. But my account of misogyny doesn't require us to know what someone is feeling deep inside to say that they are perpetuating or enabling misogyny. This definition helps us acknowledge the important truth that we are all, men and women, to a certain extent complicit in misogynistic social structures. So I have highlighted here, misogynistic behavior can be practiced without, or someone can participate in misogynistic behavior without necessarily having sexist beliefs about women. We can have, it's very easy for us in the movement now, with the knowledge we have acquired, to think that certainly we are not sexist or we are not misogynist, because we don't consciously hold on to sexist beliefs anymore. But here, the study we looked at shows us that it can be unconscious. These people that participated in these studies, that's us as a society. And we don't know whether they were conservative or progressive, but they might as well consider themselves progressives, but still the outcome, you don't have to have sexist ideas to act in a way that is to the disadvantage of women, because of these cultural patterns. She calls it here the broader cultural mores. We have been, as I said, we have been trained like this for 6,000 years. We have been trained what a good leader looks like, all male character traits. And so then if a woman tries to take a man's position, it either just looks unnatural to us or inauthentic, or we assume that she lacks certain characteristics. So it's more our instincts tell us that something is not right, and that can lead us to exhibit misogynistic reaction. Another thing I want to point out is what she says about the heart. Misogyny is not to be understood as something that it's not this hatred that someone feels in their heart against all women and girls. Of course, you have situations where this is the case. For example, when you look at the incel community, when you look at murders that are committed by, or femicides that is committed by incels, then they even admit that they are motivated by hatred. But the danger is that we focus on the extreme only. If we only look at incels and think that's misogyny, then we are only looking at the extreme and we miss out on the subtle, where it actually already starts. And the phenomenon of incels is only the tip of the iceberg. Yeah, and lastly, what I have marked as well is that if we admit to the fact that misogyny is something that is embedded in our system, if misogyny is systemic, just like with racism, you can have racist policies, you also can have misogynistic policies, then that helps us to acknowledge that we are all, to a certain extent, complicit in these misogynistic social structures. And that's what we want to avoid. That's why we need information. We need to feed our library with new information that we can draw on, so that when there is a situation around us, we experience a situation that we would usually so with every situation that you witness, how our brain works is that it classifies or evaluates a certain situation. And so something can be, you witness a situation and can be a trigger for you that would naturally make a sexist or misogynistic thought pop into your mind. And that's only because you have been trained for such a long time to think in a certain way. So you can train yourself by feeding your library with the correct information to recognize this situation, so that a sexist thought that pops up in your mind itself can become a trigger, a new trigger for a warning sign that tells you, watch out, this is a misogynist, this is a sexist thought. This is going to hurt women. So, and so you can, we can start using our slow brain to draw on the correct information we store in our libraries to start forming new habits. And that's our hope to uproot patriarchy from our lives and from society as a whole. So I hope that we could get a little glimpse into one of those male privileges that Kate Mann describes in her book, and that that it helped us to get a better idea of what we are fighting against and what we are trying to root out of our society. Let's close with a word of prayer. Dear God, thank you for the study. Thank you that you gave us this information to think about, help us to find ways to internalize it and to keep informing ourselves on the topics that we so urgently need to be educated on, so that we can form these that we can train our brain differently, that we can unlearn this social programming that has taken place over the course of humanity in the past 6,000 years, that has been passed on, so that we can take part in the work of restoring the damage that has been done, that we can turn into a living testimony to the world. I pray that for every one of us, and may you bless our remaining Sabbath hours. May you bless our thoughts, that we can continue thinking about these things and that they may settle in our minds and our hearts. And we thank you for all of this in Jesus' name. Amen.